Welcome to the Business Resilience Decoded podcast, brought to you by Asfalis Advisors and the Disaster Recovery Journal. Crisis management in today's world is ever-changing, and this podcast is our commitment to help you navigate successful outcomes for any crisis you may face. I'm your host, Vanessa Matthews. I specialize in providing insights and solutions for crisis, continuity, and resilience across industries from real estate and healthcare to terrorism in the airline and transportation worlds. No matter what industry you're in, this podcast will provide you the tools to build resilience in your organization. Welcome back to another episode of the Business Resilience Decoded podcast. I am your host, Vanessa Matthews. In today's podcast, we're talking about generative AI, how to write thorough policies for GenAI in your organization. Our guest today is James Donnelly. He is a repeat guest, and he is the Director of Issues and Crisis Management at Booth. The World Economic Forum's 2024 Global Risk Report lists misinformation, societal polarization, and cyber insecurity among the top risks to watch for over the next 2 years. And generative AI can have an impact on all of those. Today, we're joined by my great friend, JD, to share what we need to know about generative AI and what you need to know as you're creating policies for the use of GenAI in your organization. So, JD, welcome back to the podcast.
Always a pleasure to talk to you and great to be back. I'm excited. My understanding is that this podcast has not covered Gen AI yet, and so happy to get into it.
Yeah, especially not from a policy perspective, we have not. So I'm super excited. So I guess just so that we're all speaking from the same sheet of music, which you would appreciate this as a communicator, what is Gen AI and what's the purpose of it?
Generative AI, or Gen AI for short, is basically the adoption of new technology that aggregates what's out there, any data that's out. I shouldn't say any data, the data that it's fed, it aggregates it and provides answers. It provides answers based on algorithms to your query. And so the application of Gen AI for many businesses is going to bring exponential benefits, we hope, to the public, whether that's in different ways of looking at solutions, whether it's solving super complex problems in the world, by analyzing data differently, coming up with different solutions. So it's exciting. I'm bullish on Gen AI. However, I also hope that Gen AI not only gets adopted properly, but I hope that there's the right guardrails in place so that a lot of the concerns about Gen AI don't come to massive fruition. And we can certainly talk about that since this is the disaster recovery group. We could talk about the dark sides as well.
Well, speaking of that, misinformation, disinformation, I would even say diversity and inclusion are top risks that we're seeing from an AI perspective, especially if you think about coming into an election year. How is generative AI contributing to these challenges?
If malefactors begin to use Gen AI, they might do so to spread misinformation or disinformation, right? The difference between those is misinformation is just spreading wrong information, but disinformation is specifically fooling the public into thinking one thing that's not true. In an election year, sadly, there are probably groups that want to spread both. Some of those might be state actors from other countries that may not be so bullish on democracy. We may see that within our country as well. And so if you take this technology and you harness it to do bad things, it's going to do bad things exponentially better, in theory, than if we had hackers and people just, the Twitter bots and things like that. This is learning software. It will aggregate what it learns out there, and if it is given a prompt to spread misinformation and there aren't guardrails around those prompts, that misinformation or disinformation is going to get out. And certainly, I think the elections is one area where we worry about that the most. In fact, there was an article from Forbes today that talked from Davos that talked just about that. They asked some of the world's top CEOs what they were worried about, and disinformation and misinformation in elections was sort of on the top of everybody's mind.
It speaks back to the Global Forum's report on the social polarization. And so, I mean, that right there is just a huge concern with the polarizing aspects, specifically from a US perspective, but it's happening in other parts of the world. Gen AI can present biases and prejudices. So when you think about this aspect of social polarization as a top risk for 2024, how do we combat that?
First, before you combat it, you have to know that it's there, right? So that's the first step. I think that we know from case experience that Gen AI does produce some bias. The way to think of it is, garbage in, garbage out. If the data set that it's pulling from has some, whether it's overt biases or whether it's sort of systemic bias, it's going to factor that into its thoughtful answers. It's artificially intelligent answers, right? And that's where bias and prejudice comes into some of the results from Gen AI. That's in proper use of Gen AI. It still has that in there. And that's why we think human oversight over both the query inputs, the data sets, what data sets are we pulling from, and the outputs is really, really important. Now, how do you combat that? I think that, if you're a company that wants to do well or a brand that wants to do well, you have that human oversight in those three areas. If we're combating other folks that are using that to spread bias and misinformation, it's just a matter of, seeing what's at, seeing if that stuff is coming from a Gen AI product and reminding the public, or maybe educating the public to begin with, that these results have bias and sometimes some prejudice in them. And so I think, look, as a communicator who focuses on reputation management, I think that our job is going to get really, really busy in just this area, the disinformation that we talked about before, as well as some other areas. So I think it's going to be bullish for our collective, risk management profiles and professions. It's just a matter of, can we stay on top of it all? And that's a tough question.
Yeah. So speaking of risk and reputation and communication, how should companies remain on top of data privacy and security risk from a Gen AI perspective? And the reason why I'm asking is I've known you for quite a few years now. And one thing I love about you is when you're meeting with organizations, you're able to hear and understand what do you really need? And sometimes you're asking for communication, but that's not really the need or what you see because you understand the whole portfolio of risk and resilience and how all these pieces fit together. So with that in mind, how are you recommending or how are you watching some of your great clients who have this figured out? How do they stay on top of data privacy and security risks?
The caveat is I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV. I do work with a lot of legal teams on this as well. And on the data privacy and data security question, it's asking the right questions before that Gen AI gets used, right? It's will this program be mindful of data privacy laws, the ever-changing data privacy laws, and will the Gen AI kind of conform to those laws? That's really, really important. How will the data be kept secure? From everything from hackers, from unauthorized access. I guess we're talking about both on the input and the output side, right? So I think these are just a series of questions that we have to have in place when Gen AI gets adopted and used to make sure you're ahead of both data privacy and security. But that's just one of 9 areas that we ask about, and I'll just quickly go through the areas. Purpose. What's the purpose of this Gen AI? A company can get tripped up if the purpose is we want to reduce headcount. We want to use Gen AI to reduce headcount. Well, then the purpose isn't exactly right. Maybe it is. I don't know. But it would be nicer to use Gen AI to sort of expand our thinking, expand our horizons, right? So purpose is one. We talked about data privacy and security is the second. Data content quality and sensitivity. Gen AI only produces the data that goes in, and we have to make sure the quality of the data going in is good. Which data sets will it pull from? And the sensitivity of that data. We talked earlier about whether there's bias or prejudice. Disclosure and transparency. We are communicators that do believe that if you're using Gen AI, you should disclose that and be somewhat transparent about how that's being used to all of your stakeholders. There's the legal issues, which are changing it probably every week, but staying on top of all of those. Intellectual property issues. Do we own this product? The data that's going in, does somebody else own that intellectual property? Are we breaking copyright and trade laws and all of that? We talked about bias and prejudice. That's one. There's two more. Avoiding mis and disinformation we talked about. And then finally, human oversight, making sure that there are, and we also address this, making sure that there's humans looking at input, process, output, and making sure that's appropriate for humanity.
I love that because one, I love having like clear questions to kind of go through and ask, but then two, the spectrum.
Yeah.
And what I love about great questions is it allows us to, like one of our clients says, stop and tie your shoes.
Yeah. Right.
Pull up a second before we just dive into something. And so I love being able to pause and answer that because you need to think.
And one of the reasons I love talking to you is that you always ask the great questions, and it's really that purpose question is the first one that I raised that is the one I'm not seeing enough companies ask. It's sort of like the old quote from Jurassic Park. Just because we could build the technology, should we? I think the answer is yes. I think Gen AI. Again, I'm bullish about Gen AI. I hope it solves a lot of health issues in the country. I hope it brings efficiency to really rote tasks like in the legal field, like if you're a paralegal, like it should be able to help you, right? But in a lot of areas, we're seeing a rush to embrace Gen AI. I think it's because it could be a big profit driver without companies taking time and saying, what is the purpose? Why are we doing this? What benefit can we bring to humanity in adopting this other than cutting costs, right?
Yeah.
And I that's the question I'd like to see get asked more by you, by me, and certainly by the clients that we represent.
Yeah. And those of you who are listening, because you're all managing risk in some shape, way, or form. And so this is, when we're talking about a seat at the table and whoever we're engaging from a leadership perspective, these are the ways that we elevate risk. And even if they don't have an answer, the question has provided some level of awareness. So going over to policies, how do we write policies for AI for the use of a legal perspective when both the laws around AI and AI itself are changing so rapidly?
Yeah, I think that you need to first have a framework, right? So I just walked through my agency's 9-step framework that we use for clients. So that it starts there. Have a framework, and there's plenty of frameworks that are out there that you can pull from. The second is dedicate some folks to staying on top of the latest regulations, the latest laws. It's still a gray area. We know that regulations are coming. We know that laws are changing constantly, but having people that are staying on top of that, if you're not going to do it yourself, to make sure that you're compliant with all of that. And then third, making the changes, right? So every time we see something at our agency that challenges the assumptions of our 9 questions, we always stop to say, all right, do we need to tweak a question? Do we need to add a question? Do we need to remove a question? It's that simple. I'd like to use Gen AI to solve the policy problem, but that would be perhaps compounding the issues. But I do think it's just having the dedication to stay on top of it. You and I talk a lot about how so much of what we do is in the aftermath of a problem that has just happened, right? That's where the crisis plans usually get built. Is we just had this big, enormous problem. We never want that to happen again. Now let's build a plan. Well, we'd love to be at a point, both of our disciplines, where we are on the front end of it. And I think that we're in the first inning, top of the first inning of Gen AI. Now's the time to start building those policies for sure.
Well, speaking of, hindsight is 2020. So literally, no pun intended. In 2020, in the thick of the pandemic, myself, you, and a few other colleagues that you pulled together, put together some thought leadership, and it was titled Top Crisis Watchouts for 2020 and Beyond. So we'll make sure that this is in the show notes for you.
Yeah.
And these watchouts or predictions came true. So I'm going to first pause and say, can you talk a little bit about the partners that you gathered around the table? And then secondly, go into what were some of the watchouts?
They say you make a short career out of making predictions. But in our collective case, yourself and several, we are public relations reputation management firm, but I like having strategic partners in all the different disciplines of risk, so that if something goes to a business continuity area or an emergency management area, I can come to you. If somebody has an ethical problem, I have an ethics person. If somebody has a higher ed issue, I've got a person there. So we made predictions, and I'm going to change screens here if you see something reflecting off of my glasses. But every prediction came true. Just top line, we had one of our partners talk about how supply chains can get very interrupted if there's a problem, like a pandemic, because everything's so optimized now. There's really not a lot of room for mistakes or for big problems. And boy, did that come true, during the pandemic. You had a very good prediction about the manufacturing and transportation fields, and how not only recruiting millennial talent for those fields, but retaining them is going to be very, very difficult. And certainly we've seen that happen now, 4 years later. We had a higher education expert that talked about potential problems in higher ed because of a number of issues, but not the least of which is people questioning the value of education. Well, higher ed's had quite a few months. Retail, we talked about how keeping employees in retail motivated, keeping them hired. There's even a nod in here about crime and retail, and certainly that has happened a lot. There was an AI part of this. We talked about how at that point we weren't saying the term Gen AI, but we talked about how robots, AI, and automation will prompt workforces to be reskilled, and certainly we're seeing that now. So I'll stop there. There was a bunch of others, but it's rare that you have a 1,000 batting average, but every single prediction we had in 2020 to some degree came true. Some the very next year, because the next year was the pandemic year, and then we're seeing it. So I don't know, maybe we should roll the dice again and make more predictions, but in the interest of keeping everybody as prepared as we can, I guess.
Right. Well, let's predict some world peace and see what happens in 4 years.
Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? Geopolitical instability is one of everyone's top concerns right now. Yep. As well as misinformation that can affect an election. So those are the two big ones right now.
Well, and that's also having an impact on the supply chain. And so what's interesting is I was at another client engagement and we were on a panel, and AI isn't new. Like, it's been here, but the headlines are swarming like it's new. And so I think that's also what's pretty interesting is like how much you see about AI and how much it's being talked about and discussed versus what we were looking at 4 years ago, right? But like, I just think that the media has just taken those words and ran with it.
I agree. I think that Chat GPT was, and the other, voice or text-based AI systems really kind of accelerated everything. I do think that Gen AI is a little different. It would be wrong to say it thinks. It doesn't think. It uses algorithms to pull information and to come up with answers that usually are based on all those data sets. And whereas AI probably didn't think and didn't transform how it solves the next problem the way that Gen AI does. So I do think there's a difference. That said, everyone you talk to that's deep in the space is like, we're just getting started. It makes a lot of mistakes. You can still tell when an output is from Gen AI, when an article is written by Gen AI, you can kind of still tell. But these things are happening exponentially. When is it going to be difficult to tell? When is that deep fake that used to be done by people and using technology now is getting done by an intelligent algorithm that is changing it in a way that it's really difficult to spot. And so that's why I think a lot of the concerns around Gen AI are valid. Every science fiction movie we've seen since the computer age has had, HAL 2000 killing the astronauts. We've had in the Marvel universe, you had Ultron, which was the super being, AI being, killing all the superheroes. And so, that's where the public's mind is that, if we don't harness the technology, Jurassic Park, if we don't harness it and we don't have the right purpose around it and we don't have the right, it can run amok, and it can. I'd like to think it's going to bring more benefits and detriments, but we have to make sure that those guardrails are in place. Well, thank you so much for coming back to the podcast. Where can our subscribers find you? mbooth, James D at mbooth.com. We are a marketing and strategic communications firm, PR firm. We just won Adweek's, we're top 5 in best places to work. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's where I can be found. I'm also on Twitter, although I'm not on there that often, but it's at James J. Donnelly. I guess it's x.com now, at James J. Donnelly.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you for the next episode. Thank you for listening to the Business Resilience Decoded podcast, brought to you by Asfalis Advisors and Disaster Recovery Journal. Make sure you check out the show notes for this episode to see all the upcoming events, programs, and ways we can support you. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and share it with a friend. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.